There we go. Hello, everybody. My name is Yuki Yoshioka, and I'm the president of the Japan Club.
I'm Ethan Brown. I'm the event coordinator of the Japan Club.
I'm Bryce. I'm the Diversity Council representative for the Japan Club.
And thank you very much for tuning in to our very first podcast of the Japan Club, which we are doing because, well, we wanted to reach out to people during this COVID season, and we couldn't do it physically because that's not proper social distancing.
It's true.
Sadly.
So,
very unfortunate, honestly.
Yeah. Now, let us just kind of give an introduction as to sort of what this is going to be like, what this is going to be. And so, generally speaking, each podcast will range from about 45 minutes to about 60 minutes. Time is variable. And each week, hopefully, we will be discussing an aspect of Japanese culture where we pick a subject, we will tell you what it is, and then we will sort of layer it out throughout, and we will talk about it to the best of our ability. Hopefully, you can learn something that you didn't know before.
Well, ideally.
Yeah.
Unless you just know everything, but that's on you.
Yeah, if you
I
know
think
everything,
that's-
just stay around for our sparkling personalities. I'm sure that'll.
yeah.
that'll
I think that'll keep them around.
That's right. So,
Or scare them away.
with that being said, this week's topic is very simple, very broad. We wanted to keep things as simple as possible for the first one. And just so you know, before we really get into things, we're going to be posting these on our social media. You're going to get these through your emails. And feel free at any point to just tune in and out, depending on the topic, because we're just here to entertain you guys. And we don't really, we don't need the views. This isn't a YouTube channel.
It's not even monetized, bro.
No, yeah. You don't get
No,
paid.
no ad revenue, no sponsorship.
Just the kindness of our hearts.
Not a single penny, bro.
That's right. That's right. So let's get into this week's topic, which is sort of a very broad. What is Japan? What is modern Japan, really? When you think about it, how much do you really know about the country? Sort of what are your misconceptions? What are the things that you think are true that aren't true? So yeah, let's really dive into that. So let's just scan the crowd here. What do you guys think when you hear Japan, just sort of the country? What are the first things that come to your mind?
I mean, me personally, just coming from my background, like I was in like the Japan Club and like anime club in high school. So that was just when I think of it, you think of like the typical like anime, the shonen, like all that stuff, like the very cartoony, the glitzy glamour of all that. And, you also tend to think of like the architecture, like the tatami mats and things like that, or the bamboo, like these gardens, these beautiful zen, which is also kind of a misconception if you didn't really think about it, but just like these, I don't know, East Asian, but also like very Japanese concepts that kind of have become popularized recently, I feel like, where, especially if you think about like anime and things like that, I personally have only gotten into it recently, like high school and that kind of thing. So that's what I think of.
Me, it depends. If someone were to just walk up to me and say Japan, I would just think about how much I want to go back because there's so much cool stuff. Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
There's so much cool stuff and a lot of opportunities that just broaden your horizons. And I think some of my favorite things that come to mind, outside of the pop culture and whatnot, is just how cool and beautiful so many places look. One of my friends, when I was studying abroad in Nagoya at Nanzan University, he went to this out-of-the-way village off to the side of Nagoya, and there's this there's a military base out there too. That's a different story. But he was on his way to just explore and see nature, and he took this really nice picture in this alcove, and it's just hidden away and completely preserved in this beautifully ancient way.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's just this tangible power to the natural environments in the country that I think
I definitely
really
feel
worth
that.
looking into.
Yeah, no, 100%. I agree with that, especially when I was out there. I was in Hokkaido for the HIF program over. It was not this past summer, but the summer before in 2019.
Yeah.
And just even though it was very much like a city/suburb and it was very lively, there were definitely little pockets of nature that I don't. And they just held a weight to them when you walked into them, when you walked around them, and you could definitely tell that the people who lived there, not just the people who visited from time to time like me or like other students who were studying abroad, like really respected them. And I don't know if it's that we don't do that in America, but it definitely is just a different vibe. You know, I definitely feel like it's like they just appreciate nature and they think about it in a way that I feel is very different from what we have here. I think that's a different conversation, but when you kind of think of that, I definitely think that when one thinks of Japan, it's very different from when one thinks of a Western country, whether it be like America or Europe or the UK or something like that, you know? So
Yeah,
I definitely
I
think
agree with
that,
that.
yeah, whatever it is, it's different.
I want to
Like,
know what you think of Yuki
yeah,
when you hear Japan.
for me, Japan is just home. Like I go there
Yeah.
every summer, so it's very, it like for people who haven't been there, like there's an aura of mysticism that can kind of go around it, and I can understand that. That was what the U.S. was for me before I got here. But I mean, even having gone to like the U.S. and Japan and lived in Singapore for a time, like Japan is still, in my opinion, the most beautiful country to look at.
Mm.
And so like there's a lot that I can say about it. And when I think about it, I think of home. Like it's all the culture, all the buildings, all the people, like that's always kind of roped into one place for me. But my experiences tend to be much more personal when it comes to Japan. But
Mm.
Mhm.
you
Where
know,
in Japan are you from?
I'm from Tokyo, so I'm
Okay.
from, just that big city part, the part where everyone talks about. It's great because whenever anyone's like, so what part of Japan are you from? I can be like, well, I'm from Tokyo. And that's the only part that I can really identify that people, they'll be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that place.
I've heard of
No.
that place.
No, 100%. When I was, even though I studied in the northern part of Japan, I took a little vacation to Tokyo with a couple friends, and it was very much different. I don't know. It's like, even though I live next to New York and like I go there all the time, and like New York City is my home technically, like even though they're both very big cities, they're very different in a way. So even
Yeah.
with that like big city vibe that you can get from an American city versus like a Japanese city, I think they hold different. And speaking to Bryce's like little anecdote about the little alcove that his friend saw, when I was like, when we were kind of just messing around, going through back alleys and doing what you do when you're like exploring a big city, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
we stumbled upon like behind these vines that were over behind, I think it was like a boba shop or something like that. And there was like this stone bunny statue. I think it was like a bunny statue, but it had like fangs and it was almost like a demon. We were like, oh no, we're definitely like gonna be cursed or like that. But it was still like, even though we were in the middle of the city, it almost felt like we were someplace different. And I just felt like
Yeah.
that's not something that I can generally remember experiencing. Maybe I just like have it like you were talking about, Yuki, where it's like mysticized in my mind and I just remember it fondly because it was someplace I was visiting, that I don't remember similar moments when I've been to New York, but I was definitely just like, this is like completely different than anything I've experienced.
So yeah, like that actually sort of spills over into sort of the next topic, which is really what would you say Japan's defining qualities are as somebody who is familiar enough with it to sort of know its culture and sort of even having visited Japan on occasions. Like, what would you say the defining features of Japan would be?
I don't know. I mean, me personally, I think of like landmarks and like, I don't know, the fact that it's an archipelago was drilled into my mind when I was in like fourth or fifth grade. So I'll always like associate the fact that it's not necessarily a landform that one typically thinks of, whether it's like, even if it's just not just an island. There are a bunch of them. I mean, like you have the four main ones, but then also like you think of Mount Fuji and you think of Tokyo and all these like very Japan-ish things. Like, I don't know. I think definitely just the fact that they are, I don't know, just something about Japan being a set of islands, and then the fact that it's very mountainous. Those are all very like, the fact that I lived there was just very. That's what it defines it as to me.
So
you know?
you have a very geographical sort of view of Japan. That's where you focus on. Bryce,
Yeah.
what about you? What do you think?
For me, there's such a large amount of variety with the people and the food and the language itself in Japan that I personally focus on. Like the it's particularly annoying when you're majoring in the language, but the volume of dialects
Yeah.
and little
A hundred
nuances is
percent.
one of the
A
reasons
hundred
I
percent.
love casual speech in Japanese so much. It's just because you can do whatever you want practically. Um, and there are all these little nuances that definitely is commonplace in languages, but I feel with the way Japanese as a language is structured, it's a lot more pronounced. And I think that carries over into a lot of the pop culture representations and the artistic expressions that you'll find a lot. For instance, in the case of music, because I do music too, I was looking into, I guess, the way that artists put together their lyrics, and I found that the language they choose, or rather the words that they choose, is based off of more poetic word choice. I found this out because I used one of the words that I learned from a song in a sentence in my class once, and my professor basically told me that that's only used in poetry.
Hmm. Well, it looks like there's a bit of connectivity issue. I wonder if that's on my end. I think it might be.
Another, I think,
Sorry, Bryce, you cut out there for just a second.
really pulls me in. Like a lot of.
Bryce, you
Oh,
cut
did
out
I?
there for just a second. Yeah.
How
Uh,
much did you hear? Because I
uh,
thought you froze.
yeah, sorry about that. Like, I think it's just, I mean, the internet's been bad for a while, but again, sorry about the internet connection. If it happens, it happens, but we'll just try to sort of loop back whenever we can.
Yeah.
So you were
Yeah.
talking about the lyrics of music for the most part.
Yeah.
The
So I was
poetic
saying,
lyrics.
yeah, I was saying that the way that it's put together, I think, is very unique because it comes from like where you're at and whatnot, what words you use, what words you don't use, and the fact that it's based off of, I guess, the more formal in a sense, but more symbolic word choice because a lot of the words that are used in poetry are often just really old kanji that no one uses traditionally, but have a greater artistic meaning. And I think that really shows how, I guess, in depth people like to go with their art.
I see. Yeah, no, I do respect that sentiment. Like for me, aesthetic is the big defining feature of Japan for the most part. Like, when you think about like, like the view of like the temples with the sakura trees surrounding it, like that's a very powerful image. But then
Yeah.
you think of like those large metropolitan areas, which while yeah, they resemble other big cities in other countries, there's a specific kind of aesthetic you can almost get from a Japanese city or Japanese
Yeah.
Yeah.
countryside.
100%.
That's really
100%.
that's really my view of the defining
Yeah.
feature.
I definitely feel that because I'm from Chicago. And when I was going through Nagoya and when I managed to get to Tokyo as well and explore all of that, I could definitely feel, not just because of all the kanji that I had to look at and all the katakana and hiragana, I could definitely feel that the way things were organized and I guess the general sequence of buildings, even though it's still an urban environment, were distinctly unique. And maybe it's because I haven't been to any other part of Asia yet, but it felt noticeably shifted for me, especially with some of the side streets and whatnot. I feel like there are way more side streets in metropolitan areas in Japan than there are in metropolitan areas in America. Because
I
when I'm
agree.
going to Chicago, I see plenty of side streets, plenty of alleys and whatnot, but most of them are not in the areas with all the skyscrapers. Usually they're in the areas where people are actually living and going about their daily business. But I feel like
Yeah,
in
no,
Japan, there's just side streets and hidden passages everywhere.
100%. Like when I went, we tried to hit all the main ones like Asakusa and Akihabara, and then there's like the fashion district, and then we went down to like the Imperial Palace and over there, and it's just like the variety of sections, and I mean, in New York, you have like the five boroughs and all that, and those are like
Mhm.
distinct in and of themselves. But and I guess it's also just because like coming from a different place, I don't recognize it. It's not where I lived or anything like that, so I wasn't necessarily familiar. But just the like how you go from like these like stretching, winding back alleys and stuff like that that kind of branch off from the main avenues and stuff,
Mm.
seemingly without direction, to like the very structured and almost it seemed very much more planned out in like the business district and that kind of thing. But even though, and then they still felt distinctly unique, but also you could tell that it was the same city. Like I feel like I just don't get that when I come back to New York and that kind of thing. Like it felt very much its own beast almost. Like it
Yeah.
was clear that it was, even though like you were talking about, it's an urban setting and like obviously there's just going to be similarities just inherent to the fact that they're both urban settings. I think that they are very, I don't know how to say it other than the fact that Japan and Tokyo felt very Japan. Like it felt very much its own.
Mhm.
Whereas in America, I feel like it's like comparing like Chicago to New York is a lot easier than comparing like maybe Kyoto to Tokyo. You know, like they're
Yeah.
very distinct in and of themselves. And even though they have like that identity of being Japanese and like being a part of Japan, they have like just culturally and like the feel is very much different. And I think it's very much more distinctive than if it was than that you might find in like a US city or something like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I would definitely agree with all those things. And I think that I think it has to do with just Japan's homogeneity and a lot of the ways in which its history has influenced things like its architecture and its urban planning and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And really, this next topic is kind of a broader view of not just how Japan is influenced by itself, but also how Japan influences other countries. So let's really talk about like Japan's role in modern society as well. That's something that we need to touch upon, and it's obviously changed over the course of the last half century. But
Yeah.
today, what would you say Japan's major role is?
I
It's
firmly believe that Japan is arguably one of, if not the strongest cultural powers in the world.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, America's up there, don't get me wrong. We do way too much and it affects way too much. But Japan just, like, universally has this appeal for people. For some reason,
mm-hmm.
it's worked its way into so many frames of media and so many, I guess, perspectives on the Eastern world, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I don't think other Asian countries have. And I don't mean that to say like to compare them at all, really, but in terms of just the breadth of its influence from the artistic impact, from the pop culture impact, from the fashion impact, from just the sheer volume of things that Japan is involved in. That's just on the fun side. We're not even on the professional side because there are plenty of companies that are Japanese owned that people don't realize are Japanese owned. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I would say it's just Japan's everywhere. If you look for it, they're everywhere. And I don't mean
Yeah.
that in a they're coming for us kind of way. I mean that in a sincerely. That's really cool that there's just so many little, I guess, under the radar um, pieces of influential um, culture that they've
Mm-hmm.
disseminated, I suppose.
Yeah, I wholly agree with that. I think that, I mean, when you think of like Eastern East Asian countries, Japan is definitely like it's China and it's Japan and then it's like Korea. And I feel like even though it's the like Japan is the third largest economy in the world, but its cultural impact just from it being such a wholly distinct, and so it just feels very set in its personality or like impact. Like it knows a lot about what it is, and it's very like Japan knows what it is in the sense that if you ask someone from America, like, oh, where they're from, like maybe America isn't the first thing that comes to their mind. Someone from Japan, I feel like, is someone from Japan, if that makes any sense, where it's the identity with the country is very strong, and that as a fact just seeps into everything that it touches. It's very confident in its image, and I think that in a way that's different from like a China where there's this rhetoric that like, oh, China's power is growing and it's gonna take over us and we're not gonna be on top, where it's much more subtle, as Bryce was saying, and it's much more, I don't know, not friendly, but more passive, where it's much more of a cultural influence, and nobody feels like Japan, even if it's closing the gap, no one feels like it's a threat or anything like that, in the sense that it's going to destroy our worldview or something like that. I feel like there's very dangerous rhetoric about other countries that are up there in the ring, but when it comes to Japan, one of its advantages is that people don't really see it that way. And it could be just because that America is largely an ally with Japan and it's not with China. But also I feel like even with countries that it's not necessarily friendly with, it's not taken or seen as something that in the same way that like a China or a North Korea would be seen as, So I think I agree with Bryce in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, this will be probably touched upon later in the discussion, of course, when we really dig into some of these details. But I would agree that largely Japan's cultural influence is definitely sort of its role in the world today, is that it's a cultural provider. It's an influencer in that way. It influences media from, television to video games to all sorts of cultural perceptions that we have today. And it used to be an economic powerhouse, and it still is, just not as big as it used to be. And so that's not really what people look to it for anymore. And as for that thing, Ethan, you said about how Japan's not as scary, I'm not entirely sure about this perspective because I've only ever been Japanese. But I remember there was a time when South Korea, would ban imports from Japan, especially like things like video games. Pokemon was not allowed in Japan
Really?
like a few
I
decades
forgot about
after
that.
its
Yeah.
original release.
Mhm.
Because
Wow.
Korea they didn't want Japanese culture. And part of that could have been they just didn't want to be overwhelmed by it. And maybe that may have been something where they felt threatened by it. But I couldn't tell you specifically. That was a time before mine. And I'm not sure.
On a history note, that might have to do with
Poor relation.
relations between the countries.
Yeah.
We're kind of poor for quite some time and still are okay at best. I'm not very well versed in it now, but I know a bit about what it was in the past, and it was not necessarily the friendliest. So I could see why that would end up being the case, especially because, like we said, that volume of cultural influence can be overwhelming, and I can see why a country would not want to necessarily let it fully take its course through their country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, we will unfortunately need to move on to the next topic of discussion just to keep things progressing along in terms of timer wise. So the next thing, well, this is really just related, but it's really just an expansion of what we were just talking about because it's about Japan as a cultural and economic power. Let's really begin with the economics of the raw exports, things like that. So Ethan, why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like I said before, Japan is the third largest economy in the world. And a lot of that is due to after its like devastation in World War II with obviously the two bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but also like Tokyo fire bombings and all this kind of stuff where it really had to kind of build from the ground up and quickly if it didn't want to be like swallowed up by these other powers. And a lot of that like necessity breeds innovation. So they had to take these what they knew they could do well and kind of just improve it to the nth degree. So a lot of that came from highly successful car and consumer electronics industries. So as of right now, their three highest imports, I have it over here, are vehicles and then also machinery, including computers and electrical machinery. And those three alone take up about 55% of their overall export. And that kind of surprised me because I just assumed, whether it was in my ignorance or whatever it may be, that seafood and that kind of thing would be more of export, but I mean, I was kind of talking about with Yuki beforehand, that a lot of it, because of the nature of Japan's geography, like I assume they use a lot of that domestically, where a lot of their diet consists of seafood and rice and that kind of thing. So, but just speaking from purely an export perspective, I mean, I assume like their cultural exports is largely unquantifiable. So you're not going to be able to see like their impact, like the impact of anime as a market necessarily in their raw export, quote unquote, where it's like things they are shipping out themselves. But I definitely feel like they have a large hold in the market when it comes to like video games and anime and like pop culture and stuff like that. Like that as capital can be quantified. I don't have the stats there, but I feel like that is growing increasingly, like every year, every month, every decade, that kind of thing. But just speaking largely from their gross domestic product, they are the third largest economy in the world, and over half of their export comes from those three categories, which I thought was rather interesting.
Yeah, no, like that surprised me too to find out. I mean, the technology thing makes sense for the most
Mhm.
part. Like you can't walk a couple blocks down the road without running into some car made by a Japanese company. And for a time, that was the reality. Like that's the reason why Boston, which used to be this hub of car manufacturing, just fell out of favor, and because the Japanese were pumping out cars left and right, and they were making them cheaper yet better. And for a time, that was what really defined Japan as an economy. But yeah, nowadays we've just kind of remained steady, stayed the course.
Mm.
I would argue that that's really where Japan has been for the last 40 to 50 years, ever since the bubble burst.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think like one of the more notorious stories about like Japan economically, and maybe not notorious, but like one of the like their highlights, whether it be in a positive or negative context, is how they kind of take these, like basically one of their practices, if I can remember correctly, was they would send like people to learn about companies and about products, and they would take them back, and then they would take them apart, figure out how they worked, and then make them better and faster and more cheaper. And like one of the standout companies with that is like Nikon, like the camera
Nikon?
company.
Nikon, yeah.
Yeah, where originally a lot of that came from, and I might have to fact check this and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of that came from China, and they kind of, you want to say infiltrate, it wasn't like spy work, but what they would do is they would send people over there and they would bring back the cameras, and basically in like within 10 years the company erupted out of nowhere and overtook the largest camera companies and in the world, just because they were able to kind of reverse engineer and like fix out the bugs and the loops and all that they needed to fix out, and basically highly mechanized and make more efficiently than everybody else could. So I think from a purely economic sense, that can be seen as one of their defining features. But I feel like more recently that hasn't been like a practice that they've been taking up now. So I think, and then when it comes to like Samsung and stuff like that, that's more Korea and like those kind of companies. But I think when it comes to when they talk about electronics and when they talk about machinery, it's more like cameras and like washing machines and that kind of stuff, like actual products, you know.
Yeah, like Japan, post-war Japan was highly driven in terms of what it would do for success. And I think that, like, I remember hearing stories from people I spoke to back in Japan, just like how they would send people all over the world. They sent people to like Germany, to the United States, to really just learn about all of the ways in which they were deficient. I mean, this happened during the major restoration too. This happened during like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
this happened before World War II even, but Japan has always been a big proponent of learning from the people who can do it better than you until you can do
Yeah.
it better than them.
Yep.
And yeah, that has been reflected in their exports. And like you said, Ethan, things have been in a bit of a standstill recently, and you know,
I mean,
we're consistent, but it's not
mm.
not the
Yeah, I
miracle
mean,
that it was.
yeah, I mean, being the third largest economy in the world isn't something to sneeze at, you know. I mean, obviously, I think it just saying third largest is kind of undermines like the gap between the top three economies. Like you have, especially now, like the U.S. and China, like in that neck and neck race, and then kind of farther down the line, not, I think it's a substantial size, but it's not like an insurmountable gap, one might say. Used to be, but I feel like now, especially with like when you think of US's being more less export oriented and more closing down and more domestically oriented, it's definitely no longer an insurmountable gap. And I think that it's, while it's a large gap, and that is not said in just being the third largest economy, like it's still nothing to sneeze at. So I agree with that, especially when you think about how you compare like their policies now to like maybe 200, 300 years ago, when it's completely the opposite. Like it's just the reverse side of the spectrum, you know? So I
Yeah.
just think that in and of itself, and how that happened and how they had to kind of realize like, oh snap, like we've been doing this all wrong kind of is, and even not if all wrong, but just the way that it's working is no longer how it works anymore. And I think that in and of itself is a really interesting topic. And I mean, you could do a whole other podcast on just that, you know?
Yeah.
So
Tokugawa was an interesting period.
yeah.
I'm mostly on cultural exports in terms of what I know.
Yeah, so we can actually move on to that, since that's pretty much, well, there's the imports, but that's not nearly as much of a conversation. Japan needs to import nearly everything because, as an
Japan.
But yes, if we want to move on to cultural, that's probably the big one. So, Bryce, do you want to start us off on that particular topic?
Yeah, sure. So my thing with a lot of the cultural exports from Japan is that there's just so much. And I don't mean that to say there's just a lot of questionably mediocre quality things to sift through. It's all high quality and oftentimes very different from one another. I mean, even that the fashion itself, in Tokyo, in Shibuya, in Shinjuku, and Harajuku, just the various statements that people try to make and how diverse just fashion alone is, I think says a lot about how people in any sort of culturally exportable industry try to distinguish themselves from one another. And that extends also especially to the video game industry, which I think is probably one of the most popular to appreciate aspects of Japanese cultural exports, because everybody knows that one Japanese company that does that one series is going to drop some fire in like the next year or something. Like everybody just knows. Oh yeah, Square Enix, Japanese company, by the way. Yeah. This next installment of Final Fantasy XIV is going to be great. Why? Square Enix did it. This next console by Nintendo, I mean, not actually right now, but I'm saying in theory, probably going to have some good games on it because they know how to put good work together. Audio industry is equally fantastic. And on the note of audio specifically, I feel like Japanese music is very underappreciated because it's so good. And not just the stuff that is traditionally, I guess, shown to foreigners like Vocaloid, Kenshi Yonezu, like artists who pop up in anime. I'm talking about a lot of the indie artists and the artists that if you were to say their name to a native Japanese person, they'd recognize them immediately, like Mari Kondo. Who else? I'm forgetting her name. Utada Hikaru. Even though she was in Kingdom Hearts, but she's known for way more than just the songs that she has in that game. And plenty of other artists who really try to tell their stories in a very compelling way, which I think is a little different from Western music. Not to say that Western music doesn't do that, because Kendrick Lamar. like like Chance the Rapper, Big Sean, Billie Eilish, like people who tell their own personal stories obviously exist in Western music, but I would say it's a lot more personal, and it has been that way for a longer period of time in Japanese music, I would argue. Especially with a lot of the influences that have come in from the West. I looked into this a little bit. I'm not the best source on it, but I still know a bit about it. When jazz really started to blow up in the Japanese music scene, it had a huge impact on a lot of other like fields of music. So when you take apart some tracks that producers put together, Japanese producers put together, you'll find that some of the harmonies that they use, some of the rhythms that they use, some of the inspiration that they pull from is from Western jazz and funk and a lot of other like things that nowadays people kind of take for granted. Like even now in hip hop, there's a lot of little jazz influence people like to throw in, like from Anderson .Paak. Like a man is smooth with it. But those influences are, I guess, a bit more distinct in some producers' work, and I feel like that's something that people don't really know about unless you dig into the real content of some of the songs that you can find from Japanese artists. And they've got some crazy producers.
Yeah, no.
Put together some wild harmonies, some wild rhythms. Nujabes?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Are you kidding?
I was gonna say, rest in peace, man. But he like revolutionized that whole like category of music. Like without him, who knows where?
This
like,
man started 3 waves.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not. I think I agree with you where it's like the impact, and not just like the music in and of itself, but the impact. Like people don't realize how much like the Japanese artists and producers have put into pushing the needle or pushing the envelope, and innovating in ways where if it hadn't happened, music, both Western and Eastern, will look completely different, Yeah. So I think it's really underappreciated, the impact and the style shifts that Japanese artists and producers have made,
There are some people where I've heard one song by them and I hear another one from them, and it's a completely different avenue in terms of how they put it together.
Yeah.
And I think that willingness to experiment and really diversify your portfolio says a lot for the Japanese music industry. There's one group that I listen to, King Nu. They're so good. They're so good. But they have like these, like 2 songs that a lot of people, I would say, know. Prayer X, which was in Banana Fish. I don't know how popular the anime was, but a lot of people seem to like that song. And another song that I feel is probably more popular with Japanese people, Hakujitsu. They're both fantastic songs, I would say. But I think what they show about, at least this particular group, I'd say it carries over to other groups as well, is how much they can, how different they can sound despite being in the same group. And these songs were released relatively close to one another too. So it's not like they had like years to develop a different style or anything. That's just what they do. And so I think stuff like that's really just amazing to be able to see and I guess put together and take inspiration from. And on the note of producers, I'll talk about Nujabes at any opportunity that I get. Like, the man started like 3 different waves. It's crazy. Just think about how much he impacted, like, sampling and certain production styles and techniques. Like, there are so many artists who have said on record, yeah, Nujabes is an inspiration for me. Or the equivalent, Jay Dilla, was an inspiration for me. Because a lot of people like to compare them for various reasons. That's a different podcast entirely. But just that someone who took inspiration from certain Western artists to make his own thing inspired, in turn, other Western artists to do the same thing, I think it says a lot about the perspective that a lot of Japanese producers have. And the people who worked with I'm mentioning him because I don't have any other quotes for Japanese producers. He's the only one who I have quotes from. A lot of people who have worked with Nujabes said that outside of his humility, he was always interested in learning from people. And he really pushed himself to, I guess, pick apart what he's doing and see if someone else could give him an idea that would make it better. And I think that really shows the work ethic and how that's carried over through a lot of the various art forms that have been exported from Japan, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to like their kind of way that they launched their like their economic exports, you know, where it goes from looking at another culture and seeing what they can add to it or what they can take from it and make their own and that kind of thing, and kind of just transform it. I think an underrated aspect of that is that it really goes to show how much they understand like good creative processes and like the way what it takes to innovate and that kind of thing. And I think that that is one of the things that you can speak to people about and they understand about Japan, whether or not it's implicit or explicit in how they speak about it, is that Japan is a country full of innovators. You know, I feel like it's very underappreciated how much they've done. And like I said before, with music and that kind of thing, just to push the needle in different directions, you know, whether it's Sega or Sony or like these video game companies that have completely revolutionized how we think about gaming today and how we think, and Nujabes and J Dillon, these people who have completely revolutionized how we think about music, you know, where it's crazy what, even though their names are said and even though like people understand it, it's rare to see past the fact that they're a company and see that they're from Japan and that it's like this culture and this work ethic and this mindset that these people have that distinguishes them. There's a reason that they're like, it's the cultural thread, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that's like kind of can be underappreciated.
Like the fact that the economic and the cultural are so inseparable in Japan is not an accident. It very much isn't. And you can't really go far in any discussion about the impact of culture in Japan without talking about the sort of cool Japan push that was made in the 20th century, which was very much a conscious effort by the Japanese government and by many Japanese companies to really kind of sell Japanese culture to the West. That was really the main goal of that. And that was done for, you know, a variety of reasons, one of which is that you can sell video games and you can sell media and you can sell all these other Japanese things a lot easier when the citizens of the country you're selling to are already in love with Japanese culture. And that was a push that was made that still has ripple effects to this day. Like things like the Pokemon craze of the early 90s, like the 90s and the early 2000s, that was some serious stuff. Like back in the day, people would tell stories about how they would download anime off of VCRs just to watch them because that was they were so sort of popularized yet difficult to access before streaming really became a thing. And it just goes to show how big Japanese culture was at the time and still is to this day.
Bro, people still go way out of their way to get stuff from Japan. Like,
Yep.
There's a lot of stuff that I feel people are a little impatient about when they're like it's gonna come over eventually. If it's not out now, you'll get it later, type stuff. But there's definitely this, and maybe it's just my perspective on other people, I guess, because I'm cynical, but I feel like there are times where people are kind of just like, I guess, overly intrigued, because it's not necessarily that I'm not saying that the things that they're interested in are not of quality. Hard disagree. It's usually something fantastic. But I feel like people have a greater interest in something that's not native to them. And I think that's something that Japan does a really good job of doing without making it problematic. They did a good job of presenting Japanese culture as exotic, but also comfortable. In that it's not something that can be, for lack of a better term, fetishized. It's not something that's like overly, I guess, that you can overly obsess over. It's something that I feel that even now is very well structured so that it's something it's not uncanny, but not familiar. And that's, it brings people in.
Yeah, I agree. I think I hard agree with that, where it's like I mean, speaking of, we mentioned it before, but like Pokemon has like Simpsons level legacy in America, where it's like been around for so long, you know?
Yeah,
It's just,
definitely.
and then every couple of years something comes out that like changes completely how people think about it, whether it's like Pokemon Snap or Pokemon Go, you know, like you had people who had never touched Pokemon in their life picking up their phones and going out to catch these like imaginary beings that existed on their microchips, you know? Like how many companies can do that like successfully? And people called it from a mile away. Like when they announced it, they were like, oh, this is going to change how people think about virtual reality and that kind of thing, you know, where it's just goes. And obviously like things like that, like VR had been touched on before, like had been, but never, I feel like had it been so accessible, you know? And obviously I think that like when we talk about this kind of thing, like we're not talking about Japan in a vacuum. Like we're not saying that it's the only country to do that, or it's the only country that good things have come out of. But just for the fact that we're talking about Japan, this is Japan Club, like this is what our topic is. I think it's important to stress just like how much of a hand they have in Western life and styles and culture. Because I mean, you talk about America being a melting pot and all that stuff, but rarely do you take for granted that like East Asian influences are in that melting pot, you know? It's largely like Africano or, you know, European, like this kind of thing, but you can't go to California without like seeing sushi shops and like all this stuff, where it's definitely, I think it depends. It obviously varies based on where you're at, but it's just so easy. It's like in our homes. It's in everybody's home. Like something Japanese is in everybody's home, you know? It's kind of crazy if you think about it.
Yeah. All right. We're a bit over time just in terms of our topics, but briefly before we move on to our next and final topic, I just wanted to bring up, just to briefly summarize the sort of foreign relations with regards to Japan, how Japan is really perceived. We brought this up previously. Japan has always been a staunch ally of the United States ever since World War II ended. I don't have to go into detail on how it didn't used to be that way. Other foreign relations, Japan and China have always had a bit of a history of animosity, same with Korea. And it just goes to show that like your geographic neighbors tend to have the most complex relations with you as a country, and that's inevitable. But yes, Japan is very much a Western allied country in an Eastern world. And that's just something I wanted to talk about briefly before we transition into our next topic, which is kind of one that I think would hit a lot of people close to home, which is misconceptions about Japan and about Japanese culture. So what are some common ones you guys have heard before, like, or that you believed in perhaps before you really got to know Japan?
I mean, honestly, just like everybody in Japan loves anime. That's like
literally,
you know, like that's like one of the big ones where it's like, or Japan is exactly like the anime, you know, where it's this idea that because I watched like one slice of life and like Fruits Baskets or something, like that's how Japanese schools are, you know. And I think that in large part there will be, especially depending on where you are, there's that like train crossing where it's got like the doom doom doom.
Oh no, those
like,
are
everybody knows, like that's definitely that's there. Like
there's
I
one
live right
outside
next
of
to
my
one.
apartment in Tokyo.
Yeah, exactly, right. I
Definitely
lived right
left
next to one when I was there, so there's definitely like that aspect. And obviously like these things are based in reality, like they don't just pull them out of nowhere, right? But I think a lot of people who only think of Japan in like this cartoony / idealized anime sense can easily mistake these very nuanced cities and places for being less than they actually are. And like it's not always like the running out of your house with the wall around it with like a piece of toast in your mouth and like your school bag on your back, you know, like there's very much like
that only happens sometimes. That only happens sometimes.
Only sometimes, you know. It's like in the same way that not every American family like gets up at 7 a.m. before school to like eat breakfast with like the orange juice and the bacon, you know. It's very much the same in Japan, I think. And a lot of people forget that. Yeah, exactly, right? Like, when does that ever happen? You know?
How's this week looking for you, honey? Like,
like
there's a lot of Japanese equivalents.
Yeah,
like we laugh
exactly.
at that because we think it's stupid because no one does that. Well, not no one. Like, it's not like the actual American standard. And I think
Yeah.
the same carries over for a lot of things that happen in anime and manga and other Japanese dramas and whatnot. Like even down to the way people talk to one another and like some of the social expectations and I guess the way you can act natural conversation. It's not at all the way the anime might make it look.
Yeah. Actually, that brings us into a discussion about sort of anime as a misconception, you could say. Like, there are lots of things that people really don't understand about what anime even is, you know? Like,
Yeah.
it's common enough, like in the West at least, to view anime as this kind of art style. That's really how most people view it. And to be fair, that's how people in Japan view it too. Ethan, you mentioned briefly about how, like, that whole everyone in Japan likes anime thing. And having lived in Japan for a while, I can tell you that if you are very expressive about loving anime in Japan, you will be looked at like a weirdo.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's complex, just like everything is. And really, we can, like, that's a whole topic we can talk about. But the thing that I want to focus on really is sort of anime as this cultural force. And really, what is it? Where did it sort of like, how did it capture the Western imagination, and why do we believe what we do believe about it?
Because they put so much work into it, dude.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, it's one of those styles. It's like it's evident. Like when not a lot of work is put into it, like it really shows. You know, it's so easy to appreciate how much effort, especially for like a hand drawn. Like you think of like for an American example, like Disney, like the old Disney, like Bambi, Snow White. Like you can go through each individual frame and like see how they had to draw it over, like that kind of thing.
I've seen those.
I think the same carries over for Japan. You know, a lot of times, like they have to animate every one of those frames, just like every other animation company does. But just because anime as a style is so expressive and lends itself to such fantastically realistic, I don't know if that's like an actual term, but just like obviously like people don't have like the big eyes and like the like you've seen like the memes and stuff where they try to show like, what it would actually look like. Yeah, exactly. Like what it actually look like if somebody had like anime proportions and stuff like that, or like from the side profile faces. Like obviously it's not real, but it's still very much expressive. And I think that when it comes to like the expressions, like anime as a medium gives itself permission to be so fantastical when it comes to like those minute details, whether it's like the reaction faces that they try to kind of replicate in live action and always kind of falls flat, or whether it's like the chibi when they try to like, it's just so easy to exacerbate emotion and for a good effect, you know. And I think that when it comes to anime as like a definition, and obviously like it's still in dispute, like there's like whole subreddit threads about like whether or not like Avatar The Last Airbender is an anime or whatever like that. I mean, you can have that conversation if you want, but just like from whether it is Japanese influenced or if it's like an actual Japanese company making it, like I feel like there's a very distinct style where it's like you can look at it and be like, okay, that's like anime, and whether it's a loose definition or a strict definition, you know.
People
I would definitely agree with that.
Fight you for days on whether or not certain things are or are not anime, and that just goes to show how sort of divisive and sort of poorly defined it is as a concept. Because it's not even called anime in Japan for the most part. Anime is anything that is animated in Japan.
Yeah, isn't it literally just animation shorted? Because they like to make everything short. Starbucks. Starbucks.
Anything that is sort of animated is anime, because the term that we use for that particular aesthetic or that style is manga. That is the term that is used, and people often attribute that to the comics that you would see in, you know, online and stuff. But manga is just the name of the sort of generalized way in which you draw the human figure and stuff like that. Like that's all manga, whether it's animated manga or it's manga that's in a book, right? And so like the fact that those two perceptions of the word itself are so different is telling.
And I think that is also one of the strengths of anime, honestly, and just animation in general, but more specifically within the subsection, for it to be like a subsection of animation, but still be so loosely defined is what allows companies to have like what allows shows to have like the style of One Punch Man versus Mob Psycho, when it comes, and both the animations, like the fight scenes are equally as, visually impressive and like awe-inspiring. It's just so easy to operate when the borders are so loosely defined. And I think that's what gives anime its appeal, because especially with like the mass release of internet and all that, and then like how popular it got, like it was just so easy for people to access anime, whether it be like downloading it or now like streaming it with Crunchyroll, Netflix, even Amazon Prime's hopping on the wave now, so it's like easy to access like different kinds. And just because like the wide variety, whether you like shonen or slice of life or like romance or even like Gundam, like all these like the subsections, like it can literally be anything. There's a show for anybody who's out there. And I mean, like obviously there are people who will never like it just because it's animation. I mean, like those people aside, like if that's up your alley, it's something for you, like there's just so many ways, there's so much for people to explore. So
I think another thing on that note is I feel like it, for people who are a bit more familiar with some of the older animations, might feel this a bit more because animation styles have evolved, obviously. But I think one of the things that really helped anime explode, outside of like the high quality voice acting, which, by the way, Japanese voice actors are very intense and very
crazy,
dedicated to their work. They are
just
so impressive. Like almost universally. To the music production quality, Hiroyuki Sawano, Attack on Titan, plenty of video games, Nobuo Uematsu, practically a modern Mozart. I think one thing that really helped anime explode was the level of like timeless quality of some animations. So in the example of Akira, which is a very well-known Japanese movie, the way that it was animated, I'm pretty sure every frame was hand drawn and colored. So like everything like blends together in this. It looks dated, obviously, but in this almost seamless and I don't even have words to describe just how at ease, I suppose, every frame looks to me when I watched it the first time. It just all seemed so natural and so, I guess, precise that it really was art. And I think a lot of people appreciated that when anime was really starting to take off, and that carried over through a lot of shows as well that might not have had the same level of intense production as a movie would, still have that same dedication to having a unique art style. You can look at one anime from a particular studio and know that it's from that studio just because of the art style alone. Like Studio Trigger, very well-known studio. They did Kill la Kill, Promare. I think they did Gurren Lagann as well.
They did,
But like looking at their artworks and seeing just the dedication to perfecting their craft that's carried over throughout the years, I think really is what's gotten anime so far into so many people's radar for good cultural export from Japan.
All right, yeah, no, this is a great discussion, and I'm loving it so far. But that being said, we've talked enough about anime, I think.
Yeah.
Like I fully agree with all of that, and I'm sure that once we have a topic specifically on anime, we will definitely go further into what we've discussed thus far.
Multi-part episode. This is a multi-episode.
Yes,
bro, the anime podcast. That's gonna be like anime music, and then anime in general. Because they're honestly.
Yeah. So let's talk about sort of the more physical aspects of Japan. Like, for instance, one of the things that people often seem to have a lack of understanding of, at least, are sort of like the whole foreigners thing in Japan. How do we? I say we as if I'm Japan, but like most people.
You do that a lot.
I've been doing that this entire podcast. I will continue to do this. And so, like, how do we treat foreigners and stuff like that? Like, how are Westerners perceived and all that? These are these can be a bit difficult to understand from just from living in the U.S. What would you guys say?
It's a big variance.
Yeah.
Well, not only in what I've heard, but also what I've experienced. There's a in when I was on my way back from Nagoya, I had to take like a different train to get to the airport than I took to get from the airport because it just times didn't match up. So I had to take this roundabout way to get there. Um, and on my way back, I actually ended up going a station too far because the conductor who was checking to see where I was going like didn't make sure that I knew to get off. I thought he was saying that something else was going elsewhere at a later point. I didn't realize he meant like that particular train, like get off that one and then go to the station over and then go. But there was this nice guy next to me who was like, hey, if you're going where I think you're going, because he saw that I had my suitcases and whatnot, you're supposed to get off this at the stop before us. And so he went with me to like make sure I was good and had all that settled. And at this point, I was way out of Nagoya, so I was no longer in an urban environment where it's pretty common to see foreigners. People are more welcoming, I would argue, and you don't really have any issues. So he was all nice, whatever. And as I'm, double checking to make sure I don't make that mistake again, I ended up at one station, and at this point, I know plenty of kanji, but I don't know every kanji.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up at one stop, and before I got off to the wrong stop, I walked over to this seemingly nice woman and I asked her, is this Otogawa, which was the station that I was supposed to get off at? And she kind of just like awkwardly looked at me. And I didn't say anything untoward. I was very polite. I said it properly. Like, and grammatically, I was fine. That's a very simple question, light work. She looked at me really awkwardly and kind of just said no. And then when I went back to my suitcase, I saw that she like went to a different car. And there were other people in the train who also kind of were like looking at me weird, like what, like why did I walk up and ask that question? Which I think speaks to like the huge variance you can get with, I guess, people's experience with foreigners. Because it wasn't necessarily that she disliked me. I definitely didn't feel malice. Trust me, I'm familiar with malice when it comes to race. But I feel like she was just uncertain of how to conduct herself around me, and that made her uncomfortable. And I think that is something that says a lot for the experience of a foreigner in Japan. If like whenever people were to treat you differently, at least this is again in my experience and from what I've heard from other people who start in America or Europe and move to Japan for an extended period of time, it's not necessarily like a dislike of, or like not a direct dislike of you. It's more of an absence of a knowledge of how to deal with you in the context of Japan. It's that because there's this huge thing, it comes up linguistically as well, but there's this thing with inside groups and outside groups, and foreigners are obviously an outside group, and it's not necessarily problematic or personal, but I think when the clearest outside group is in a personal circle, people might not necessarily know how to deal with that if they don't have much experience. And that is, I would argue, why urban environments like Nagoya, Tokyo, Kyoto, probably Osaka as well. I don't know about Osaka. Why when foreigners are there, there's not much of not an issue, but they don't feel like they're out of place. But when you go to a little bit farther out, like not a suburb, but a prefecture that's a little bit away from a lot of high traffic business areas and common tourist locations, people get a little bit more uncertain of how to deal with a foreigner.
No, I agree 100%. I think that me being in Hakodate, which was, it's not like a Sapporo on Hokkaido, but it's definitely like, it had like a city-ish vibe, and like we would take the trolley or the train system to school every day. And just being on the train with my friends, like you could definitely feel when people noticed that you were on the train, like people noticed when you got on and when you got off, like that kind of vibe. But I
Yeah.
definitely agree with Bryce where it was never, I can't say ever there being like a malicious moment or a hostile moment. And I mean, in the specific context of Japan, that might have to do with like this conception that just as, you know, a culture, as a society, they don't necessarily showcase how they truly feel in the moment. And there's like this whole idea that like they have like the face they show to like other people and the face they have at home and like that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And whether or not that's like you want to take that at face value or not, I definitely feel like compared to like somebody who might be in America or me personally from New York, where it's like very obvious what people think of you. Like if you cut somebody off, they're going to let you know they don't like you, like that kind of thing. It's definitely very different from what obviously I'm not like a tourist or a foreigner to America, but I've like seen interactions just like walking around and like being in the environment of an urban life and that kind of thing. So I definitely feel like it's different. Like I feel like if I was a tourist in America, I would definitely get a whole different experience than me being a tourist in Japan. Like even though I lived there for a while, like the convenience store lady literally knew me by name because I would literally always go there to get pork buns and stuff like that. Like I loved her so much. But like that kind of vibe, I guess, is 100% different than I feel like if it was in America or that kind of thing. But yeah, I definitely feel like I agree with you with just the fact that Japan is such a homogenous country. They don't typically, especially in the outside prefectures, when there's not like an Osaka or a Kyoto or that kind of thing, or that kind of city or that environment, they just don't interact with people who aren't Japanese. So when someone tries to interact with them and they're not Japanese, even if they speak perfectly fine Japanese, like Bryce was speaking, it's just like a kind of moment, and they don't know how to. It's not like it's more like just an apathy. Like there's, like you said, there's just a lack of emotion, the lack of knowledge on how to deal with it. Whereas if even if you're in like a Midwestern city, like we understand that there will be like just from the makeup of America, it's like so heterogeneous. Like you talk to people who even in the most like non-diverse culture, like they still have knowledge of how to interact with people who aren't them. And I mean, like obviously that changes based on experience. Like not everyone's gonna have the same experience, but I just feel like by and large in America, it's different, and there's like an understanding that, and it isn't even necessarily a bad thing. It's just like how Japan as a country is like 99% or 99.9 whatever percentage, like the vast majority of people who live in Japan are Japanese, whereas you come to America, you get like a whole smorgasbord of people who are from everywhere. And just like as a byproduct of that, they don't like Bryce said, they don't know how to react when somebody who is not Japanese comes up and talks to them. And that's not like a shortcoming or anything like that. It's just how the company operates as a whole, you know? So I think from that, and I think that kind of thing, if you're not really thinking about it in the moment, it might come off as hostile or it might come off as rude. But I mean, I think it just takes a moment to think about it and be like, given the situation that this person might have experienced, this person might have been in their whole life, like they just don't know. But in the moment, it might be like, oh, that person was rude. Like they're rude to tourists, or they're awkward around tourists, like that kind of thing. So I guess that's where the misconception comes in. If you don't really think about it, it can be easy to mistake awkwardness or not knowing how to react for rudeness, or like, I don't know, not necessarily malice, but like just hostility or rudeness, you know? So I guess that's where the misconception comes in.
I think that comes into manners as well with Japan, because the general way to deal with a problem in a social setting is to not deal with the problem. To be brutal, it's just you acknowledge the problem by pretending it does not exist very aggressively, so that eventually it goes away. That's obviously very generalized, but I would say that definitely does carry over into that as well. Like people, the way that I guess it translates over is a bit different, but I know someone who I think her mother, or was it her father? Or maybe it was her aunt. I don't remember who it was. one of her relatives lives in Japan her whole life and then came over to the States to work. She perfectly bilingual, so friend couldn't tell that she was Japanese. And when she was speaking with her coworker, they were, I think, gossiping or something. So they were saying something of questionable morality. Um, and her coworker's response to her was, and I don't direct quote because we PG, but shut the up in like a shut the up girl type thing.
Mhm.
And she did not know how to respond to that because you don't say that in Japan. You don't tell someone to shut up, and you don't swear, let alone to a coworker. And so like for her, that was just a huge just culture shock for someone to be so casual and direct. And I think that carries over to the treatment of awkward situations in foreigners because the best way to address a problem is to not address it sometimes, for at least if you're handling things in like I guess, in a conventionally expected manner. It's a lot more polite to kind of just not say anything sometimes, or if you say anything, you do it very indirectly. So I would like in the case of what happened with me, um, her indirect way of telling me no was like awkwardly looking around and saying nothing and pretending for a moment like I hadn't said anything. But because I didn't walk away immediately and because I was very clearly engaged in a conversation, I couldn't play off that I was in that conversation. Like, it was clear that I had started. Her only option was to answer me and then remove herself from that environment so that the awkwardness would like dissipate, which for Westerners actually intensifies awkwardness, at least from what I've been told. I personally don't care, but from what I've been told, removing yourself from an awkward situation just makes it more awkward. But in this case, it kind of stabilized everything and reinforced the status quo of we are on a train independently going places and none of us really need to interact at all. And I guess that's like the kind of the setting that had been like unconsciously agreed upon. And so in order to reestablish that, that was the response. So I think with the case of foreigners, that's something that like we kind of have to like tune our brains to, especially if you're learning the language. It's something you kind of have to get really quickly. Is that there's a lot of unspoken expectations in the language itself as well, but also carries over to the culture. So when you're interacting with people, there are things you kind of just got to figure out on your own and hope that you got it right.
We're a bit over time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to wrap this discussion up just a little bit. If I may present a brief insider's look into sort of this perspective, I fully agree with everything you guys have said so far. Like the discussion was really good, so I just didn't want to interrupt. But essentially, like it's as you guys were saying, you know, like there is such a complex back and forth of manners and interactions, and a foreigner is a unknown and unpredictable element to that. And because of that, we'd rather just push the problem away than to deal with it head on, because Japanese people don't like dealing with problems head on. And I can tell this not just because that's just how my parents have sort of like encouraged me to react to situations, but also just because that's how I can perceive how the public looks at a foreigner. Like I can blend into a train just fine, even though I speak English. But when somebody who's clearly a foreigner comes onto a train, you can like, I can tell when people are just kind of like every now and then just glancing over. Like it's not that they're malicious. It's just more like, oh, what is this chaos element going to do to my daily routine? You know, it's more like that. But yeah, everything's said so far. I would agree with most of it. Yeah. So with that being said, I think we will need to wrap this up pretty soon. So just any closing thoughts, anybody? This has been interesting. I've liked what we got so far.
Yeah, no, I think that's just like as an end note, like just a button on it. I think just like that kind of conflict averse indirect style is really just what characterizes Japan. I mean, it goes into like the defining characteristics as we were talking about earlier on, and it's just like it seeps into everything, even like the language. And I mean, you guys will know with how rather than say like you're being loud, it'll be like chotto, and then like the 10 like that, and they just won't say it. And it's like, it's interesting because the words in and of themselves, just like chotto, 10, like it stays the same, but it applies to every situation in a way that without context clues, you never know what they were saying. You know what I mean? So it's very much like context based. You have to infer, you have to understand what's going on. And I feel like American culture can be classified as a very unaware culture. Like people, I feel like from an outsider perspective, it's easy to characterize us as like kind of ignorant, don't know what we're doing when we're doing it. But on the flip side, like you have Japan and Japanese culture where it's very much you need to be in tune with everybody around you, or if you're gonna like understand what's going on, what's the vibe in this train car that I'm on right now, like catching those glances when they look at you, like that kind of stuff. It's very much unspoken, very much, you know, nudge nudge, wink wink kind of thing. And just like I feel like that characterizes the whole language, the mannerisms, all the misconceptions. It can really boil down to that, just like that disconnect between, specifically in our situation, American and Japanese culture, but just Japanese culture in general, and like any misconceptions people can have, you know. So
subtlety is key. The
Yeah.
devil is definitely in the details when it comes to a lot of Japanese things.
100%, yeah.
So yeah, no, thanks very much for listening, everybody. And if you have any topics that you'd like to suggest, anything that you want to know more about, we are happy to take suggestions, work them in, and we'll tell you guys everything you might not know or might already know. And so yeah, you can email those to our Japan Club email. You can contact any member of the Japan Club Officer Board individually to bring that up. Either way, it doesn't matter because we'll just keep talking and we're gonna
Someone's gonna listen eventually.
Yeah, no, thank you for listening. And we will see you hopefully next week.
All right, see you guys.
Been a pleasure.